welcome to today's episode of Gateway Spotlight with your host, Brooke Roberts. Now, you might be wondering, I'm not Brooke Roberts. Brooke Roberts has allowed me to be a guest host for today's episode of Gateway Spotlight. And I'd like to welcome you and everyone here today very much to this episode. And I'm very excited to be here, I must say, because we are going to be having a fantastic discussion around the topic of recruiting international students with a pathway to citizenship and topics related to that. If this is your first episode of Gateway Spotlight, welcome. And if you're coming back, welcome back. And if you're not familiar with Gateway Spotlight, this is an occasional interview show, so to speak, that we have where we shine a spotlight on individuals or topics or events or organizations that we think are really important to contemporary international higher education. And today we're going to be doing that. We're shining our spotlight on the topic or the question therein. Is the U.S. ready to recruit international students with a pathway to citizenship? Now, this topic came to me actually last fall. I was in Toronto, Canada for the Pi Live conference, and I attended a very, very interesting panel discussion. And the panelists were focusing on how various countries around the world are proactively implementing policies to attract and retain the best and brightest students from all around the world, but in part to strengthen their pipeline to skilled labor. Now, the panel raised a key question for me, and that question was, is it time for the U.S. to consider expanding post-study work rights that allow international students to more easily stay and work in the U.S. after they graduate? Now, we know other countries around the world are doing this and doing so very successfully: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And so the key issue for today's discussion is really around the question, are we ready, at least here in the United States, to allow a person to enter with a non-immigrant intent, sort of, I intend to leave the United States after my visa ends, but while also allowing for the possibility of them staying? Or while in the United States, I also want to try to qualify for a more permanent status. Now, here to answer these important questions, we have Dr. Miriam Feldblum. Hello, Miriam.
Hello.
Everyone, Miriam is the co-founder and executive director of the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration. She has over 25 years of experience in higher education administration. Her teaching and research focus on immigration policy, politics, and higher education. She was previously the vice president for student affairs, excuse me, and dean of students and a professor of politics at Pomona College. And she earned her PhD in political science from Yale University. Now, as I mentioned, she is the co-founder and executive director of the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration. This is an organization, folks, that brings college and university presidents and chancellors together on the immigration issues that impact higher education, our students, campuses, communities, and our nation. The Alliance works to advance just immigration policies and practices at the federal, state, and campus level that are consistent with our heritage as a nation of immigrants and the academic values of equity and openness. Now, the Alliance is composed of, get this, over 500 presidents and chancellors of private and public institutions, colleges, and universities that are enrolling over 5 million students across 43 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. Welcome, Dr. Feldblum, and welcome everyone to today's episode of Gateway Spotlight. I'm so glad you're here. We have a lot to talk about.
We do. I can't wait.
Well, let me ask you the first big volley of questions, if I may. And folks, I might just want to point you to the Q&A feature here in Zoom. You're welcome to pose your questions and we'll address those as we go along. Also note that there is the chat. The chat is enabled if you want to chat there, maybe announce who you are, where you're at today, and what maybe brings you here to today's episode of Gateway Spotlight. Now, as we go through today, we're going to be posting some key resources that have been gathered by the Alliance and some other sources as we go along today. So please be sure to click on those and bookmark those resources, because I think if you're here today, this is a topic of interest to you as it is to me. And so you're going to want to know about these resources. Okay, Dr. Feldblum, would you provide, please, a general overview of what other countries, I mentioned some, are offering with regard to post-study work rights vis-a-vis a pathway to citizenship for international students, and frankly, what you recommend the U.S. do?
Thanks so much, Tony. I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks for everything you and your group do.
Thank you.
So let me answer the question by focusing on the two policy questions that are implicit in it. One is, what are countries doing to intentionally and strategically recruit and retain international students for study and post-graduation work opportunities? Are they offering them predictable and clear pathways for employment or to permanent or long-term residency? In other words, do they have a national recruitment and retention strategy for global talent, and specifically international students as part of that global talent? So that's one question. Then the other question also that's implied is, are there obstacles to longer or permanent residence? And if they want to stay, if international students after graduation want to stay, do they have opportunities to naturalize, right, to become citizens? What obstacles do they face when they seek to stay in the country where they have studied? And also, what kind of obstacles do their family members whom they brought with them or who they want to bring face, right? So let me start with the US and then talk about the other countries. So as you mentioned, current US policy places international students into a non-immigrant status. But it's not simply a non-immigrant status. It's a status in which, due to the requirements of the F1 visa, they have to declare their intent to depart after their course of study in order to be approved for the visa, right? If they cannot kind of demonstrate that intent, that can be an issue of a reason for why they get denied. There are some non-immigrant visas in the US, such as the H-1B visa, which is a non-immigrant employment-based visa in which individuals are not closed off from potentially becoming immigrants. H-1B visas could become immigrants. They have a pathway, a potential pathway to lawful permanent residency or to become a green card holder. Now, many international student alumni in the US seek to overcome these obstacles that they face after graduation. They participate in optional practical training and look to transition to another visa that would enable them to become prospective immigrants, especially the H-1B visa. So they can launch careers, they can put down roots, have some stability and predictability in their lives. Also, their employers want that too. Now, many are blocked, actually, but others successfully transition, perhaps to an H-1B visa. But here, too, when we think about the second question about obstacles, international student alumni who are on H-1B visas can face many obstacles due to the severe green card backlog for certain nationalities in the US. Their spouses and children may also face obstacles, whether to employment or to be able to stay and so on. So all in all, when we look at those questions, in the US, there's no intentional recruitment or retention strategy. In fact, just the opposite. You have to explicitly declare your intent to leave, and lots of hurdles. Now, in contrast, let's look at other countries. So you mentioned Canada. Well, Canada has developed a national recruitment and retention policy, which accelerated in 2019 with the international education strategy, right? Building on success, which is a coordinated effort between multiple branches of government to promote international student flow to Canada, not just for study, but look, you can become prospective immigrants. We are looking for talent. And they announce changes and improvements every year. The number of international students choosing to study in Canada has jumped significantly over the past year. Stuart Anderson showed that there was a 52% increase from 2016 to 2020, and that has just continued to increase. So as the US has been losing market share of international students since 2000, Canada has jumped in their market share. And even more damning for the long term are the number of international students who have obtained degrees in the US and then are recruited by Canada, right? So according to the Niskanen Center, Canada recruited close to 40,000 graduates of US colleges and universities who are non-US citizens and were most likely international students. Not all of them, but most of them were likely international students. Those are hard figures of students whom we invested in through their educational programs and then lost to Canada for their careers and contributions. Now, we also know the UK has launched the Global Talent Visa, which targets immigrants, right, who are leaders or potential leaders in academic and research or arts, culture, technology. They're recruiting also students who've graduated from US institutions, certain US institutions, to come to the UK. In Australia, I'll just do two more kind of examples. In Australia, there's an explicit conversation in Australia where higher education entities are calling for facilitated pathways and greater retention of international students, right? The move to uncapped work hours for international students was part of their efforts at recruitment. They also have a visa program targeting recent PhD graduates. In Germany, the 2022 National Skilled Labor Strategy specifically mentions international students. So the DAD president highlighted that they need to show the increasing number of international students in Germany the path to a professional career there. So we have, on the one hand, the US clearly behind this curve, and in fact, kind of doing all that we can to put hurdles before international students and obstacles for us if we want to have those students to stay. And then we have other countries who are gaining in market share and gaining in, attractiveness to international students, and international students being able to stay. That's the issue that we're talking about.
I really appreciate that overview. It actually makes me recall some years ago, I was in New Zealand, and there I was able to travel around New Zealand at the invitation of the government there. And I was going even into some more remote areas. And I learned there that they were recruiting international students, or still are recruiting international students, not just as a pipeline to recruit a skilled labor, but also as a way to populate rural areas where they're experiencing urban migration. And I thought that was just so fascinating. And so one of the questions I want to ask you today is, or maybe you can help clarify, this is not really a new conversation, is it? But it is one that seems to be really bubbling up really in a very robust popular culture way. Why now?
I love this question, and I want to kind of build on what you were saying, what you were seeing in New Zealand, because we're seeing some of that now. We had the Republican governors, right, of Utah and Indiana saying, we need immigration, we need global talent, we need ways to, encourage the recruitment, whether through international students, other kinds of immigration, because we have labor shortages in our states. Right? We think about the low level of unemployment, think about certain industries really needing new talent. And this is not either domestic talent or international talent. It's a yes and. Investing in our domestic talent, including our domestic immigrant populations and students, and the need for international students and international talent. So the first answer, there are like three reasons I would highlight of, yes, you're right, this isn't new, but what's particularly urgent and compelling right now? The first one is economic pressures and the imperative, right? From across the political spectrum, from across the US, Republicans and Democrats, business leaders, industry, higher education are saying we have shortages, and specifically in certain, more in certain sectors than others. But the economic pressures is without immigration, and we already see the results. Declining immigration actually, cause economic pressures on us, and increased immigrations helped prevent greater inflation. So that was a report that just came out from forward.us. about, and from George Mason University, a new study on that. So economic pressures is one. Then demographic imperatives, right? So certainly in industrialized countries, the demographic cliff, and we hear about this in the US, is real, it's now, and it's growing. So without a influx of, or kind of a retention and kind of reaching out to students who are not now going to colleges and universities, campus communities, small towns, large towns are feeling the loss of students. And I want to emphasize too, this is not simply about, recruiting international students. It's also about ensuring the retention of current students, reaching out to immigrant students in the US, reaching out to adult learners and all. But there's a demographic cliff in the US, which requires an end-to-end strategy, which is we need international students as well as being able to recruit all of our domestic students. Together with this demographic imperative is also what's happening in countries in the global south and elsewhere in the world, where there's a large demand for high quality education that can't be met in the countries of origin. And there's large numbers of growing, talented, amazing students who are looking for colleges and universities to go to, and for economic opportunities. So the demographic pressures are felt differently around the world, but they're very strong. And then finally, I also want to mention all the climate conflict and other humanitarian disasters. So I think higher education in the US, at least, is also very aware, getting more tuned, I think is already aware of all the displaced students who need pathways to higher education. Globally, only 6% of refugee students are able to access higher education. Only 6%, far below the national global average. UNHCR has set a target for 2030 of 15% of refugees should be able to access higher education. We should be part of that solution. But all those three, economic, demographic, and then climate and other humanitarian disasters, have this conversation take a different flavor right now.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think those three, economic pressures, demographic imperatives, and climate, humanitarian disasters, and so forth, I think that is a very compelling argument. But let me ask you, when I first heard that panel back in October, I was thinking, I just don't see that happening. So I was very, very skeptical about it. But then as I've gotten to read more of the information from the President's Alliance and some other sources, it seems to me that this isn't time now. And so I'm wondering, gosh, so what? What do I need to do? What are the policies or policy changes that need to happen right now?
So that's a great question. And I think we first can start with conversations like this. And in the US, the conversation has to be nuanced, because higher ed leaders, international student service officers, and so on, government officials need to acknowledge that international students are non-immigrant visas. So here I am talking about we need to facilitate pathways to enable international students to really be prospective immigrants. In reality, so many international students overcome those hurdles and become first-generation immigrants. Our policy does not allow for that. So acknowledging first, there is a policy constraint, but then let's be creative and innovative. Why do we need it, and what could it look like? So for example, the President's Alliance just partnered with UMass Boston, the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, as well as the Harvard Immigration Initiative, to have a conversation about higher ed pathways to immigration. And what you saw there were campus leaders, advocates, administration officials recognizing the need for this conversation, recognizing the need for policy change. So the first thing to do is let's understand this, right? So higher education often speaks about international students within the context of international education and not within the context of immigration pathways. Let's, you and I and others, start changing that conversation and the narrative. that would also educate congressional leaders to why we need to change the law, right? So there are two key things that we need Congress to act on. One is to establish dual intent for international students. An administration can't do that alone by executive action. That needs to be an act of Congress. And second, we also need to increase the cap for green card, for green card holders. Right now, there's both for H-1B visas, but also for green cards, the severe backlogs, right, make it very difficult. Even if you say to international students, you say, okay, now we've established dual intent. If there's no pathways for longer term residency, then we're not, we're not addressing both policy issues that I raised at the front end. So there's conversation, there's congressional advocacy of dual intent and increasing, the number of green cards and addressing the green card backlog, as well as many others. But I'll just raise those two. And then there are administrative actions that we can also take. And as higher education, institutions, as advocates, we can ask for, a better, use of curricular practical training so that international students can experience kind of the valuable hands-on work-based learning that's essential to their career development. Right now, CPT, or the practical training, also optional practical training, have a lot of constraints. What can we do within the context of administrative action to actually enable international students to do more of what we now expect all students to do, right? To do more experiential learning in the workplace to complement their in the classroom, in the lab experience. Second, I think it's also really important for us to articulate and to ask the administration to articulate goals for the inclusion of a broad diversity of international students. So, one of the things that's very important to the President's Alliance is to recognize that we should be recruiting and supporting and welcoming more students from the global South. And that's something I can talk a little bit more about, but that's, an administrative action. It was great to see the State Department, Department of Education release the statement of principles, supporting international education, but there's more that can be done in terms of administrative action to help support the recruitment of international students and facilitate within the parameters that they can pathways and openings to employment and longer residence. Conversation, congressional advocacy, administrative action.
Let me ask you just a quick tangent. When you use that term dual intent, I think I sort of captured that at the beginning, but can you just underscore very simply, what do you mean by dual intent?
Absolutely. So establishing dual intent would mean I can, I can go back home after graduation, right? Or go to another country after graduation. Doesn't mean they have to go back to your country of origin. Very hard for displaced students, actually. I can intend to leave the US, or I may intend to stay in the US, right? So dual intent means that you're not required to have this singular intent to leave. So we talk about establishing dual intent.
And just to underscore, the reality is many students are going for embassy interviews for their student visas or scholar visas. And if they hint even toward staying on in the country, they could risk getting their visa approved. We know that.
Yeah, can I just say, Tony? No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say that stay tuned, because my colleagues Rajika Bandari and Jill Welch and partners, we're going to be putting out an analysis of visa denials and the disparate outcomes when you look at regions and countries, and what that, what that should mean for us, and what we can ask the administration to do in order to address that.
Thank you. Let me just pause for a second to invite everyone here today to do utilize the chat or the Q&A function. I've got plenty more questions, but we certainly would like to pose some of yours as well. So feel free to use the chat function and the Q&A, whatever is most convenient for you. And we'll be able to get to those questions in just a moment. We don't have a lot of time in the Gateway Spotlight, so let's maximize the time that we do have. I want to just very quickly turn a little bit of our time now to just some of the benefits of this again, and then more of the challenges. Real specifically, let's pretend that this happens. What impact does offering a pathway to citizenship have on the retention and success of international students? And basically, how can this be measured and evaluated for our society?
Thanks so much for the question, Tony. And I would say, by the way, that one can frame this not as international students, here's your pathway to citizenship, but international students, you're coming in on a non-immigrant visa, but you have the opportunity to transition to an immigrant visa, right? So it's a somewhat different framing. It's more of international students need the predictability and certainty that if they want to stay after graduation, they find the position, they're wanted from employers, they want to stay, there is a pathway, a predictable, stable pathway to do so. That's a little bit different than saying international students come and come to the US and become citizens, right? That's not what we're saying. It's more of once you have that pathway to permanent residence, you may become a green card holder, right? There's certainly many green card holders, but you will then also, after a certain number of years, have the opportunity to apply for citizenship, to naturalize. And all that gives permanent stability, predictability in not only the lives of the student, right, of the alumna or alumnus, but also for the employer, right? For employers who want to attract and recruit these students, oftentimes we want you to stay. We want you to be able to get the job, and we want you to be able to stay. So the benefits of it are certainly for the students, right, to have the predictability and stability. And it's also good for employers and communities who want to retain them, address talent and labor shortages. And again, it's not either domestic or international. We are in a situation, both because of the demographic imperatives and the economic pressures, that we need both to support and accelerate the opportunities for our domestic students, as well as intentionally recruit and retain our international students.
I think I really appreciate how you succinctly summarized that. But let me ask you, when I hear you speak, you're very, very compelling, and this is and I'm convinced that this is the right road forward. But and I suspect many people here today are also similarly inclined. But there are a lot of people out there that are scared of this. They confuse immigration with all sorts of border issues and all the rest. There are a lot of challenges to this conversation, and it's not just policy. There's cultural challenges. There's confusion out there. What do you see as those big barriers?
This is such an important question. And let me take one step back to say, as you may know, the President's Alliance really brings, as you said, college and university presidents and their institutions around the immigration issues that impact their students, campus communities, and the country. So that's not only around international students, but it can also be, and it is also around undocumented students, right? Refugee students. So I think that, as we think about all these students, there are commonalities, right? In terms of wanting stability, wanting, a durable solution. For undocumented students or dreamer students, they are American, and yet they face obstacles to work, to protection, to actually being acknowledged in the country that they call home. For refugee students, they are fleeing, whether it's conflict, climate, or other disasters, and they are looking for durable solutions. They're looking for protection, right? And so there are ways in which campuses have been, the environments for these students to find both their, to be able to flourish and to be able to find their potential, though they still get stopped because of their immigration barriers.
Mhm.
And I think the same is for international students. When we look, but when we look at the immigration politics, there are those who will conflate everything that's happening for maybe those who are American, but then they'll talk about the border, right? They'll say, we can't do anything until we secure the border. Or they will talk about, we see this in Florida and Texas, proposals that did not advance, but proposed legislation to ban nationals, including international students, from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And we've seen the anti-China bias and the xenophobia. I think what's important is to address each of these issues, not to walk away from these issues, right? But to educate, to advocate, to listen. So one of the things that we're doing as an alliance is that we work in a bipartisan, nonpartisan way to talk about the immigration issues that impact international students, but also Dreamer students and refugee students. Understand the pressures and the issues at the border, right? Recognize, these are Americans who don't have, who are American everything but paper. The border, yes, let's talk about the issues around border management. And I think this is difficult for higher education, where traditionally, and again, I understand it, we just want to talk about the students within the confines of our campus. Students come with families, families come with communities, communities come with all these other competing commitments. And I do think we have to find a way to engage those who may not agree, make not only the economic arguments, not only the demographic arguments, but also recognize, what does it mean to be American? Where has our richness and excellence come from? From my perspective, I think that we can talk compellingly about how diversity drives excellence. It's not apart from excellence. These are not easy conversations, but I think that's part of what we need to do.
I think this is really food for thought here, because I do think there are a lot of folks that would not be in support of this conversation today, right? In fact, one question that comes to mind for me is, how would we ensure that this is a fair and equitable process? Meaning, how do we create minimize bias from countries by country or country of origin, socioeconomic status, for example, recruiting or retaining these students from the more economically advanced countries versus countries considered developing? How would we ensure that this would be fair and equitable?
Key question, and I love it, Tony, because this goes back to why we're doing the analysis around visa issuance denials, right? What kind of outcomes can we identify? And do we have reasons for it? Can we ask the administration, when we want you to develop a national recruitment and retention strategy, but we want you to be attuned to what you just asked about. Let's make it equitable, accessible, as well as smart and strategic, because they go together. So that, I think, is really important. I think that it's not only around a matter of equity, by the way, in terms of thinking about how we're recruiting students from the global South, especially as we open up new opportunities, but it's also just fiscally smart and strategically smart, because that's where so many of the students are. So if we want to, attract global talent, that's where global talent is. And so we need to do it both. And oftentimes, sometimes we can think about this as, we're doing these students a favor, and these students are just providing us money, right? But in fact, holistically, what higher education needs is students to drive enrollments, innovation in our education, and that's students from around the world.
Let me ask you one more question, and then I see a bunch of questions are coming in now in the chat and the Q&A. I just have to ask you, Miriam, how would you rate the Biden administration thus far in advancing higher education pathways to immigration?
promising and positive in terms of some of the actual changes that they have made. So one of the things the Migration Policy Institute put out an excellent overall analysis of the policy changes that the administration has enacted. The President's Alliance has also in our administrative agenda put out an analysis of those immigration issues impacting higher education. There has been a lot of changes that undo some of the harm from the previous administration and also expand. Have they done everything we wanted? No. Are we still, engaging with them to do more? Absolutely. But they changed the FAM. We were talking about dual intent and non-immigrant intent. They changed it to make it more clear that an 18-year-old may not have the roots that you would expect a visitor to have. They're 18, they may not know, young students. They also making it very clear, an international student may go to a community college as well as a university, a small college as well as a large college. That should not be a bias against, in providing a visa for that student. So they've done a lot of things that helped with STEM talent, especially. They expanded the OPT STEM categories and so on. There's still much more to do. And in our administrative agenda, we do list a range of including a top 10 as a list of things that they can do.
Very good. Well, I hope, by the way, that this analysis and other the research that you're doing comes out in the form of reports and so forth that we can share with our viewership and others in our profession. Let me turn now. We're going to have to be very quick. We're going to do this. We're going to do a lightning round here with some key questions from the attendees here today. Let me just do the first one. What are the employability issues and or career development programs that can help institutions recruit viable international applicants who may be interested in remaining post-graduation?
Great question. And I think institutions who explicitly talk about the supports that they have for career opportunities will make a difference. I also think that institutions, here's a radical idea, my radical idea for the session, which is think about the type of immigration legal services you can offer your international students as they consider post-graduation opportunities, for them to understand more. Often we say to international, you want to figure out some H-1B issues, go talk to an immigration lawyer. What if it could be done as a consortium? What if there's some immigration legal services that international students can consult with that is part of what the higher ed institution acknowledges is part of the suite of services that they provide? Again, I think there's possibilities there even within the policy constraints. I'll also point, what's interesting, I noticed one institution, actually, it was a group of Black students demanding some greater services and some changes in the administration. This was a small private institution, and one of their demands was to help the international Black students with their career opportunities. Right? So thinking about that, can you be proactive and not reactive on those fronts?
Thank you. I'm just gonna throw two more quick questions at you. The next one is, what are your thoughts on the recent developments with graduate visa programs in Australia, where there's concern over student quality, or in Canada, where there's a focus on limited capacity and permanent immigration levels? What elements from those examples can the U.S. learn from in framing an effective policy here?
Really important questions. And I think that one of the things we need to do is learn from others and recognize that we probably won't have the point system that Canada has, right? So what does work for for the US? And let me just give you an example with the H-1B visa registrations and the concern that USCIS has had, that there's been so many multiple registrations for single individuals. Is this fraud? What's happening? And one of the things one can do is to give the choice to this, to have a one registration, but that the individual can choose then which of their employers they want to go with, rather than having the the decision be at the employer, but actually give more choice to the individual. So with all these, both in terms of, potential quality issues, potential, are people gaming the system? Is there a limit? Learn from both what we have as well as others, and recognize that this is an iterative process. I think that the backlogs and the green cards is one great example. Dual intent alone will not solve the issue. We do also have to solve the issue about what's the pathway and openings, how many slots are there for green cards.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And this next question comes from somebody who's very, very attuned to international student recruitment. And the question is, how do these issues today impact current recruiting programs? And more importantly, what is anticipated for the future?
Okay, you put it this way, and I want to know what that person thinks. So whoever that is, I'm happy to go into have a conversation with you. But here's what I would say is, one, the US is already losing market share. Two, other countries are ahead of the curve. We're behind the curve. Three, the opportunities and brilliance is out there in terms of our international students around the world, students who are looking to come. So I think it affects us in that if we just stay with the status quo, we're going to continue to lose market share. We're going to continue not only to harm students who want to come, but also harm our community's economy and innovation sector. So what we can do is just change in positive directions. What we do know is that declining immigration hurts our economy and innovation. So if we can increase the number of international students, but also really provide pathways, I think that's going to be key. Germany, was it Germany who wants to double the number of international students who stay in Germany? This is not a static target. This is a moving, dynamic landscape.
Well, I think that's not very encouraging to hear, but it's very realistic, isn't it? Everybody, I realize today we've only just barely scratched the surface of this very important and timely topic. I'm feeling the need for a workshop, Miriam, on just helping to understand the policies and the structures around this, because I think there are implications like the last question posed. Folks, you can see there on the background of Dr. Feldblum's background there, the higher ed immigration portal. I encourage you to have a look at that. Every time I go there, I keep looking and looking. Next thing you know, 2 hours have passed by, but there's a lot of information there about economic contributions, state level policies, federal policies, effective practices for campuses, folks like many of us who are at university campuses. There's a lot there. Dr. Feldblum, thank you so very much for being here today.
Tony, thank
all
you.
The great work you're doing.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, and also just want to extend my thanks to everyone who's working in this field, who is working to support international students and displaced students. And I know many international student officers also work with domestic immigrant students. So thank you, and happy to continue the conversation.
Well, let's do that. I think you're going to be at NAFSA, so let's make sure we all go there and visit with Dr. Feldblum in person there. And everybody, I want just to note, if the questions today that I posed, if you like them, and I hope that you did, you might be surprised to know most of these questions today posed were developed by ChatGPT. I actually used an AI platform to generate the questions for today. And if ChatGPT is unfamiliar to you as it was, and it still is unfamiliar to me, you'll find the next upcoming episode of Gateway Spotlight on May 17th. Our regular host, Brooke Roberts, will be back to interview two leading experts in this topic around the question or the promise of AI in international education, and basically how can we leverage ChatGPT and other types of platforms to enhance global learning and engagement. And I want to also invite everybody to make sure, if you haven't done so, go visit the Gateway Spotlight website. There you'll find, tomorrow you'll find the recording from today, because I'm sure I will go back and listen to it, but also you'll be able to find the recordings from previous episodes as well. And while you're there, be sure to check out the new Gateway calendar. It's not a calendar of Gateway, it's a calendar for international higher education. So if you're interested in what's going on in your neck of the woods or around the world with regard to international education, that calendar is there for you. It's free. So if you have upcoming events, and Miriam, if you have upcoming events, feel free to use the calendar. Let's share this news so that we can all plan and maximize our times when we're traveling, as well as to bring attention to the events that we're coordinating. Everybody, thank you once again for being here today. And as I said, the recording will be available tomorrow or soon thereafter. Miriam, thank you so much again. And everybody, thank you, and we wish you a good day.